to the UNA USA 2019 Global Engagement Summit. My name is Rachel Bowen Pittman. I'm the Senior Director of Membership and Programs for UNA USA. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. I just want to remind everyone, please no food or drinks in the General Assembly Hall. We don't want other world leaders to come in and find anything in their seats, so please don't have any food or drinks. Wi-Fi access is available. To connect to Wi-Fi, you'll go to UNHQ Wi-Fi. You don't need a password, just put your name and email, and then you can connect to the internet. Please make sure to turn off all of your cell phone ringers. And also, as you can see, our summit is at full capacity, so please don't put your belongings in empty seats. And most importantly, I think you guys have already started this already, throughout the day, please engage with us on social media. You can use hashtag USA for UN, that's hashtag USAFORUN, tweet at us at UNA USA, and tag us on Instagram. There obviously will be a lot of great moments, so I hope you continue to capture them throughout the day. And at this time, I would like to bring to the podium Kathy Calvin, President and CEO of the UN Foundation. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. You are the champions for the UN, champions for multilateralism, and you are protecting progress. Thank you all for being here today. We've promised you a fantastic day. It's going to start with the Secretary General. It already has. And it will be closed by the President of the General Assembly. I can't wait to see how the rest of the day goes. And I know, Mr. Secretary General, you are going to look out at this audience and see why America is standing tall for the United Nations. 1,900 people in this room from 45 states, 100 college campuses, every corner of our country and every generation, because you believe in the purpose, value, and principles of the United Nations and the work it's done. And beyond this room, it's evident in the 100 or more college campuses that we've opened, one every week, and in the record number of people who will be coming to Washington to carry the message to members of Congress in June. So Tita Banks and all of you, congratulations on what you're doing and what you're going to be doing. So I want to get right to your conversation, Q&A included, with the Secretary General. So I'm going to give you the speed dating version of his leadership. 3 Ps. The first is peace. It's why the UN was created in the first place, and it's the top priority for this Secretary General, who has spent 24/7 in his term thinking about preventive diplomacy, protecting against conflicts, and making sure that we get to a peaceful planet. Second is parity. When it comes to supporting women, this guy really walks the talk. Under his leadership, for the first time ever, the UN senior leadership has gender parity, and there's gender parity in all the resident coordinators around the world. And he's just getting started. And the third P is planet. You know, not every climate crusader wears a cape. Some of them wear a suit and tie when they go to work to fight for our planet. And this Secretary General has shown he knows how to be the top diplomat, urging us all for more ambition and urgent action on climate and making this a better world. We are so grateful, and you're going to hear more about his plans for that today. And I guess there's one more P, Portugal. This is the first Secretary General who also served as a head of state from his home country of Portugal. And I'm so proud that we're here with him today. Please join me in giving a very big UNA welcome to Antonio Guterres.
Dear friends, may I suggest, there were many possibilities of photos with some of you, but not with all of you. So if you don't mind, before I start, I will go there to the first row and ask one of our photographers to take a picture of the whole group, including me, okay? Well, dear friends, it was indeed a great honor to be member of the USA for the UN. Welcome to the United Nations. And I am very grateful to Cathy Calvin and the UN Foundation for making this happen. And I also thank Teta Banks and the leadership of the United Nations Association of the United States. And I want to congratulate you on the 75th anniversary. And we will have next year the commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And I hope there will be lots of occasions for interaction with the peoples of the world, starting by the people of the United States of America, in order for the UN to be able to reform and to be more able to respond to the aspirations and the needs of the peoples of this world. Now, before we start our conversation, allow me to make 3 very quick points. First, and a simple thank you to you all as Americans. Even at the height of the Second World War, USA's founders knew that grassroots American support would be essential to create an organization that could win the peace. And among them was Eleanor Roosevelt, who had such a profound influence in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and who worked so hard to build your organization after she retired as US Ambassador to the General Assembly. And throughout the history of the United Nations, since its founding in San Francisco in 1945, the United States leadership and generosity have always been indispensable. It is no coincidence that the first words of the UN Charter, "We the peoples," echo the US Constitution. I believe the US Constitution starts by "We the people." Here it's "We the peoples," but it's the same inspiration. And I recall from my time as High Commissioner for Refugees the importance of US support, the largest donor in humanitarian aid around the world, the largest contributor to the United Nations core budget and to our peacekeeping operations. And over the years, the United States has played a critical role in helping to provide multilateral answers to global challenges. I always say that the US engagement in the world is one of the strongest forms of support to the United Nations and to our activities. And so I'm very happy to be with all of you here today. And then we need multilateralism and the engagement of the US more than ever, because we live in testing times. From climate change to migration to terrorism to the downsides of globalization, our challenges are more and more global and more integrated. But the responses are more and more fragmented, despite the fact that no single country or organization can address these issues alone. It's a kind of a paradox. As our threats become more global, our capacity to respond becomes more fragmented. And that is why we are facing the enormous difficulties and problems we face in today's world. But of course, saying this is simply not enough, because there is a trust deficit out there in the world. As inequality grows and people in all regions are questioning the effectiveness of international cooperation and of organizations like the UN. And so the biggest challenge for governments and for institutions like ours is to be able to show that we care especially for those people that feel that they are being left behind with the technological progress and globalization in the rust belts of this world. To show that we are able to mobilize solutions that respond to the people's fears and anxieties with answers, with concrete answers for the problems we feel. And we need to demonstrate that the UN is standing up for the people left behind and disconnecting to their needs, aspirations, and everyday problems. And I believe the UN is delivering. In the last 2 months alone, we won approval of the work program of the Paris Agreement on climate change in Katowice. Many people thought we would not be able to do it, but it was possible to bring together all countries of the world. We didn't solve the climate change problem, but at least we approved the work plan of the Paris Agreement. We adopted also the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And in our surge of diplomacy for peace, supported by the UN, we are trying and we are starting to succeed in some very important situations of conflict resolution. You have seen that it was possible to broker a ceasefire in Odeida, in Yemen. Let's hope it brings peace and a political agreement. We had recently an important peace agreement on Central African Republic. South Sudan, it was possible to bring together the two leaders and to finally look for the possibility of peace in this country where people have suffered so much. And the US was so strongly engaged for the independence of South Sudan. So I believe the peace in South Sudan has a huge meaning for the population of the United States. But to deliver more, we need to have a UN that is more nimble, more effective, more cost-effective, and more able to overcome the bureaucratic problems and the impediments that always exist in international organizations. And to do all this, we need you. When I look on all of you from dozens of states and universities around the country, I see ambassadors. Ambassadors for understanding, cooperation, and connecting the world of the United Nations with the grassroots. There is no more important issue today than in this context, and I would single out this problem because it's probably the most dramatic that we are facing. We need to together address climate change, the climate crisis. And I know that you agree with me. A recent UN Foundation poll found that climate change is a top priority for young Americans. But climate change is unfortunately running faster than our efforts to slow it. There are good news because there are solutions at hand in the pipeline. There is a technological evolution that makes more and more the green economy the economy of the future. But political will is still lagging behind. And that is why I'm convening a Climate Action Summit in September here in New York to raise ambition. Ambition for mitigation, for adaptation, for financing, for innovation, to really defeat climate change. And today I'm asking for your help in sounding the alarm and in highlighting the solutions. I'm going to tweet a call for #ClimateAction, and I want you to all respond on Twitter, highlighting the steps you are taking to beat the climate change. And I will feature some of our responses on my own Twitter account. Like that, we will be together in this very important endeavor. I firmly believe that we can win this race if we all pull together. And the same argument goes to all our other challenges we face in today's world. You are all committed multilateralists, and I thank you for your service as ambassadors for a better world. I feel inspired by your energy, by your engagement. Keep it up, because we need you more than ever.
Thank you.
I believe that you have some questions.
Yes, and I'm going to help you with those questions. Before the summit, we asked UNA members, and thank you for those inspiring remarks, by the way. Before the summit, we asked UNA members to submit questions. We got a lot of great questions, but we're just selecting a few for you to address today. So the first person, I would like to ask David Blattman of Andover, Massachusetts. David, if you can press your mic and ask their question.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Secretary General. My name is David Blattman. I'm an international relations student at Suffolk University in Boston. My question for you this... Thank you. Thank you, sir. Much obliged. So, my question for you this morning is, in your view, in your opinion, what is the greatest threat to international peace and security that we face in the modern world? And perhaps more importantly, what can we do to address that? What can we do about that?
looking at today, I think the biggest threat comes from the fact that we have a number of conflicts that are becoming more and more interlinked, with fighters that go from one place to another. If you look from Nigeria to Mali, from Mali to Libya, from Libya to Syria, from Syria to Yemen, from Yemen to Afghanistan, you see all these conflicts becoming interlinked and linked to a threat of global terrorism. There was always terrorism, but it was kind of an isolated terrorism, and I felt that the United States was probably the first meaningful target of global terrorism with the 9/11 terrible tragedy that we all recall. But now it became a threat everywhere. I mean, we can have a terrorist attack in any place of the world at any time because it became a global threat. And this combination of conflicts multiplying and interlinking with terrorism is probably today's biggest threat. But I think that we have a serious problem with non-proliferation. Chemical attacks have been multiplying, as we have seen, and there is a clear ban on use of chemicals. And we are now seeing the risks in relation to the nuclear non-proliferation, with some of the pillars of the nuclear disarmament agenda being put into question. So I think there are new threats coming, and we need to be careful. But for the moment, I still think it is this combination of conflicts interlinked and terrorism.
Thank you.
For peace and security, there are other threats. Climate change is a big threat to all of us. The misuse of certain technologies, like information technologies, artificial intelligence, is another potential threat to all of us. But for the moment, I think, for peace and security, the one I mentioned is probably the largest.
Thank you. Our next question.
And of course, what can we do? We are very much engaged in active mediation in many of these conflicts. And we have launched a new office for counterterrorism, and we are creating a network of plans against violent extremism all around the world to try to address the root causes of terrorism in many societies in close cooperation with those societies. And if you look at the mediation efforts that were possible in Yemen, in Libya, with everything we have tried in Syria, I mean, it's the idea to try to disconnect those conflicts and to disconnect them from the terrorist threat.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ruth Miller from Alaska. Ruth, if you can press your mic and have a seat. Press your mic, please.
Where is Alaska?
Yahlidu Ruth Miller shi'iji, dena anak hanaga shathkun kenash chikanik haliki diki. Hello, my name is Ruth Miller, and I'm a member of the Kuryong tribe of Dena'ina Athabaskan from Anchorage, Alaska, attending Brown University. Alaska and the Arctic are particularly vulnerable to climate change, where resource extraction has had devastating environmental and humanitarian impacts and is only being accelerated despite international agreement. Indigenous people in the circumpolar north are beyond are suffering today the loss of land, water, and food sources, threatening the preservation of our cultural practices. What new commitments will the United Nations make to culturally reflexive climate justice for the defense of the environment and the indigenous people who depend on it?
Well, indigenous people, and I would say the developing world in general, as in Africa and in other parts of the world, have this paradox. They practically do not contribute to climate change, and sometimes they are the main victims of climate change. And so we need to combine two very aggressive campaigns. One for mitigation, to make sure that countries, especially the G20 countries, the largest countries in the world that correspond to 80% of the emissions, really reduce the emissions, because without reduction of the emissions, we will be facing a catastrophic situation globally. But then we need to have a very strong increase in our investment in support to adaptation in the areas that are more dramatically impacted, and indigenous peoples are clearly in the front line. And until now, the investment in adaptation is proven to be not enough. If you have seen, and now I'm not talking about only indigenous people, but you have seen the disasters in the Caribbean and even the impact in the United States of some of the storms that take place, you see how much we need to invest in making sure that our communities are more resilient in relation to the impacts of climate change. And the indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable, so we need to have a strong support to their countries in order to be able to provide them with those instruments that allows them to resist better to the climate change impacts.
Unfortunately, Your Excellency, we're out of time.
No excellencies, yeah.
We're
You know
out
that
of
it's
time.
true. I mean, where I work with my colleagues, if anyone says Excellency, there is a fine of $1,000. And that's how we are trying to solve the financial problems of the UN. It's true.
So we want to thank you for spending time with members of the United Nations Association of the USA. We appreciate your leadership. We'll continue to support you and continue to support the United Nations. So thank you.
There's still time for a third question.
I can't say no to him, so he's asked for a third question. So we're going to have our third question. The final question will come from, let's see, Brian Ramirez from San Antonio. Brian, could you please press your your mic?
Yes, thank you.
Where are you?
I'm right here. Right here. Over here. Hi, Mr. Secretary General. I am Brian Ramirez from San Antonio, Texas. My question is, with the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment throughout the Western world, what efforts to protect the human rights and dignity of refugees and immigrants around the world is the UN committed to?
So the question was? You know, I was High Commissioner for Refugees for 10 years. And refugees are those that flee, not because they want to leave, not because they want a better future, but because they are forced to flee by a conflict or by oppression, by violations of their basic human rights, by a dictatorship in any part of the world. And so in relation to refugees, there is an international law obligation for countries to protect refugees, and for refugees never to be sent back to their countries of origin. And our appeal to all countries of the world is to keep their borders open to refugees, and to grant their protection, and to allow them to integrate in their societies, at least during the time in which they are not able to go back to their countries of origin. And I would say that this international protection regime, until a few years ago, was widely respected. We are seeing now, unfortunately, a trend, especially in the richest countries of the world, to be more restrictive in relation to refugees. The good news is that when I look at, for instance, an African continent, I was there just 1 week ago, African countries are keeping their borders open, are receiving sometimes more than 1 million refugees in one country, the case of Uganda, the case of Ethiopia, and really trying to do their best to support them. And we need to mobilize the whole of the international community, first, to share that burden, to also receive refugees, and second, to strongly support those countries that are being so generous, like Jordan, like Ethiopia, like Kenya, and that have received hundreds of thousands, sometimes more than 1 million refugees. Now, migrants is a different story. There is not the right of a person to migrate anytime, anywhere. But we also need to make sure that the human rights of migrants are respected. And we need to understand that we need to combine the interests, legitimate interests of states with the rights of migrants. Now, I come from a country, Portugal, where the fertility index is 1.3. Fortunately, it's not the case of the United States. But which means that the Portuguese society is not sustainable without migration. We will disappear in time if we have no migration. And my mother is 96 years old. And she has a 24/7 support of someone with some, I would say, healthcare capacity, always there to support her. When I visit my mother, I've never seen a Portuguese taking care of her. And Portugal is not a very rich country. It's always migrant workers that are there taking care of my mother. And when one looks at the situation in my continent, in Europe, more and more, even to take care of elderly people, migrants are absolutely essential. Which means migration is a positive thing. What is negative is the fact that so many people are forced to migrate in a way that is irregular, in the hands of smugglers and traffickers that tragically violate their human rights, and we need to combine more opportunities of legal migration, a strong crackdown on smugglers and traffickers, being able to persecute them with the same efficiency that, for instance, we have in relation to drug traffickers, but at the same time more and more to invest in the countries of origin to give people the possibility to choose to remain in their countries and build their future with confidence in their own countries. If you combine these three things, I think we will have a much more humane world in which migration can play a positive role for the people themselves and for the countries, both north and south. Okay? Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Well, I'm Peter Yo. I'm president of the Better World campaign, and that was an exceptional moment to have such an open and exceptional Secretary General who's prepared to listen to what people have to say and share his time with us. So again, thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for an amazing speech and for engaging with us today. It's my pleasure to introduce another great leader, the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs of the United States House of Representatives, Representative Eliot Engel of New York. Now, those of you from the New York City delegation know Eliot Engel well. He has represented parts of the Bronx and Westchester County in Congress since 1989. And just this year, after years of exemplary service on the powerful Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Engel became its chairman in January. Throughout his tenure, Chairman Engel has been a champion for strong and effective American foreign policy. In the past several years alone, he has pushed legislation demanding accountability for war crimes committed in the Syrian civil war. He has spoken out forcefully against ethnic cleansing in conflict zones, including in Kosovo and Myanmar. He has moved forward with legislation to try to force an end to the brutal and ongoing civil war in Yemen, and he's demanded equal protection for LGBTI individuals around the world. Chairman Engel is a member of Congress who delivers time and again, not only for his constituents, but for those of us who advocate for a strong American role in the United Nations. He has fought against U.S. funding cuts to the UN Population Fund, which helps ensure that every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's dreams are fulfilled. He opposed the U.S. withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council, even while expressing his frustration that the Council disproportionately focuses on Israel. Every step of the way, Representative Eliot Engel has been there for a strong American relationship with the United Nations and for an effective U.S. foreign policy. We are deeply grateful for his continued leadership. So please join me in welcoming to the stage a great American leader, Chairman Eliot Engel.
Thank you, Peter. I was hoping that I wouldn't have to speak after the Secretary General because he was so good. So here I am right after the Secretary General. I want to tell you how great it is for me to stand here and look at you, because I remember as a kid growing up in New York, visiting the United Nations with my class several times, sitting down and watching what was going on. The Secretary General then was someone called U Thant. He was from Burma. And we all were taught that the United Nations was really a great hope of the world. And here it is many years later, and I'm standing here before you in this wonderful body. Makes me feel like I've accomplished a little something. When I look at all of you, it really makes me feel great because you're our future. And the fact that you're here and understand how important the United Nations is for all the people in the world, it's very happy. I know that now in this country, in the United States, we're undergoing a whole controversy over immigration. You know, my grandparents came to the United States 110 years ago from Eastern Europe, seeking a better life. It's the same reason people are emigrating all over the world, fleeing persecution, seeking a better life. And I believe that immigration helps the country that the immigrants go to, because who comes and emigrates? Not lazy people, people who are industrious, people who don't know the language, have to learn a new language, people who are willing to better the lot of their family, and in doing so they better the country that they emigrate to. Now, it's true that you can't just have anybody come and move and have totally open borders, because we all know, unfortunately, in the era of terrorism, we have to be very careful. But it's important that the dignity of every human being, every man and woman, every child is respected. And I think that's what makes me so happy to be here at the United Nations, because that's what it stands for. So I want to say to all of you, welcome to New York City, my hometown. It always makes sense to me that the United Nations chose New York for its headquarters, because the way I think about it, there's no more diverse, exciting international city than New York. So I want to say to all of you, I hope you get to experience some of that while you're here. Just walk the streets and see the people from all walks of life and all parts of the world. Listen to the different languages being spoken, try the food, and listen to those wonderful New York accents. I was 21 before I realized New York had an R in it. You know, in New York, if you live here, you say New York, New York. But I say New York now because I've met some people from outside. I'm sure you'll find New York remarkable, as I do, because I know the sort of curiosity that brings a young person all the way to New York to learn about the UN. It gives me a lot of confidence to see a generation of future leaders like yourselves engaging with global affairs and learning about diplomacy. And it's the kind of curiosity I always had as a kid growing up in the Bronx at a time when this building and the modern international order were relatively new. I still live in the Bronx, and I represent the Bronx in Westchester in the United States Congress, and I have the honor of being the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But I still have that curiosity. Only now I have the honor of serving as chairman, and we're the committee that oversees all our federal agencies dealing with diplomacy and development, and that includes a lot of our country's work with the United Nations. So I'm glad for the opportunity to share a few words about this organization, what it does well, what it might do not so well, because we're all human, and why it's important. But first, let's take a step back. The United States is the most powerful country in the world in terms of military, economy, culture. Nobody else can project influence around the world the way we can, not by a long shot. So if we wanted, we could throw our weight around. We could say we're going to use our might for our own interests, and if you don't like it, you can pound sand. But the problem with that is, in the long run, it doesn't really work, because a country that isolates itself, that bullies smaller, weaker countries, that doesn't play by the same rules as everybody else, ends up with groups of countries lining up against them. That's the case, too, when a government ignores the rights and prosperity of its own citizens. So even as the most powerful country in the world, we can accomplish a great deal more when we partner with other countries than when we go it alone. Countries that share values or have mutual interests. And by building those relationships, it makes it easier than there is a country that's not playing by the same set of rules. When we decide American leadership and American power are needed to right a wrong, it's easier to share that burden with like-minded governments. That's what multilateralism is all about. And the UN is a forum that makes that sort of work much, much easier. There are UN members that we don't agree with, and who don't agree with us. Absolutely. But there are also many countries that do share our views. By and large, and by working together through the United Nations, the UN becomes a critical instrument in addressing some of our greatest global challenges. We see it in UN peacekeeping missions, bringing stability to war-torn regions, in work to expand across to women's health, to the effort of UNAIDS helping prevent the spread of HIV. We see it in areas of dire leadership where the UN helps provide assistance and convenes parties with the goal of ending violence and demanding accountability. A few specific examples. If you've been tracking Congress's work the last few weeks, you know the House just passed legislation that would dial back America's involvement in the war in Yemen. This war is such a heartbreaking catastrophe. 85,000 children have starved to death. 14 million are on the brink of famine. More than 1 million suffer from cholera. And the ongoing military operations are bringing us no closer to a resolution. When it comes to Yemen, we rarely hear any good news. The one bright spot is the fragile ceasefire in place that holds the promise of bringing warring parties to the table. Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, deserves much of the credit for this process and for the progress. At the same time, the UN Resident Coordinator, Lise Grande, has marshaled the world's resources to help meet the crushing humanitarian needs. Every month, the UN's World Food Program feeds more than 7.9 million Yemenis. UNICEF is helping children cope with the unimaginable horrors of living in the midst of conflict. And UNHCR continues to build shelters and run community centers for displaced Yemenis. These efforts alone will not resolve the crisis, but without the United Nations, backed by governments around the world that want to see a political solution to the violence in Yemen, these glimmers of light would surely go dark. Likewise, in Syria, UN humanitarian efforts are bringing relief to more than 2 million Syrians every month, providing temporary shelter, winter protection, and life-saving medicine. Just 3 months ago, UN trucks rolled up to a displacement camp, Rukban, which had been cut off from assistance for nearly a year. These trucks carried vaccines against measles and polio for 10,000 children, cold weather clothing, and basic health and nutrition supplies. UNHCR, the UN office that springs into action to address refugee crises, has acted quickly to process millions of refugees and provide assistance to them and the communities hosting them. And these arms of the UN have performed this heroic work with unspeakable violence going on all around them. The world owes it to the personnel on the ground, and more important, to the people of Syria, who have endured nearly 8 years of unimaginable suffering, to push for an end to the bloodshed. That brings me to another point about the UN. As much good work as the UN does, the organization, like others, has its drawback and flaws. Any member of the Security Council can veto a resolution, and frankly, Russia, a permanent member of the Council and a staunch supporter of the tyrant ruling Syria, Bashar al-Assad, has vetoed every effort in this body since 2015 that would push the crisis in Syria toward a political solution. It's appalling. Every veto is a vote to prolong the crisis, to prolong the war, to take more innocent life. That underscores a challenge that faces the United Nations all the time. I talked earlier about how it takes coalitions and partnerships to stand up to bullies on the world stage. Well, bullies have found ways to manipulate this organization as well. The UN should be a place where moral clarity prevails, but not every government subscribes to that view, and instead, the mechanisms of the UN are exploited by some members to embarrass other members they don't like. The problem is particularly acute when it comes in the way Israel is treated at the UN. Criticism of any government is fair game, certainly including our own and including Israel. But in last year's session of the UN General Assembly, 21 resolutions were passed that singled out Israel compared to just 6 that singled out any other country in the rest of the world. Out of 10 permanent agenda items at the UN, 1 concerns just Israel. Why does anti-Israel bias matter? Because there are so many other hotspots in the world that deserve the UN's attention, and as I've said, would likely benefit from the good work the UN does. The more time the UN spends on Israel, the less time will be spent dealing with human rights violators around the world, such as China, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, North Korea, or Zimbabwe. The citizens suffering in those countries deserve better. I offer this criticism in the hope that American leadership will help to deal with this problem in the years ahead, not as an argument to walk away from this organization, but about strengthening it. I could go on and on about the good work the UN does, down to very specific examples, like the work of the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, that we call CICIG, that has done incredible work to root out corruption in that country. There are scores more examples of success stories like this one. But I hope you all continue to explore the vast, fascinating world of foreign affairs. It becomes clear that very, very seldom are foreign policy issues black and white, all kinds of shades of gray. We have to work with countries we disagree with on certain things. We're far better off working in imperfect multilateral organizations that allow us to build coalitions and find solutions to global changes. And we should use American leadership, rooted in American values, to push for the changes we want to see. I'm so happy to stand here before all of you, before a future generation of public servants and thinkers, the people who will claim the mantle of leadership and carry on the world of building a safer, more prosperous world. I'm grateful for your commitment, and I think that one day you'll be here and have very important roles in keeping world peace. You know, one of the things that I love is when people come to Washington and want to go to the Foreign Affairs Committee and want to intern there and do kinds of things that are so important for the world. You're those kinds of people. No matter what country you come from, whether it's the United States or any other country, we need you. Society needs you. The world needs you. I'm looking at all of you. I see only great things. And I really want to tell you, thank you for coming here. Be involved. Stay involved. Do what you can. One person can make a tremendous difference in the world. And when like-minded, good-minded people band together, there's nothing we can't accomplish if we put our mind to it. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful time this week. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for being with us today and for your inspirational words, and really understanding, explaining how the UN is dealing with humanitarian crises in so many different areas of our world, and how we really can't do it without the broad UN family working to make sure that civilians are protected around the world. So thank you. So this morning we've heard from the top UN leader, Antonio Guterres, and the top congressional leader on American foreign policy, Eliot Engel. I'm now pleased to introduce the top American representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Jonathan Cohen. Now, Ambassador Cohen's job in New York is to represent America's interests at the United Nations, political, security, economic. And we're fortunate to have one of America's top diplomats serving in this role. As a career U.S. Foreign Service officer, he has served our nation in Iraq, France, Cyprus, Italy, Sweden, Austria, and Israel. Ambassador Cohen has guided American foreign policy towards Europe and the Middle East, and has served as a key aide to secretaries of state. Just over the past few weeks here at the United Nations, Ambassador Cohen has spoken out strongly for accountability for human rights violations in the Central African Republic, a free and prosperous Ukraine, a credible and durable solution to the civil war in Yemen, efforts to reduce the number of child soldiers, and the provision of desperately needed humanitarian supplies to displaced Syrian refugees. He's been busy on our behalf and on our nation's behalf. We are incredibly grateful that we have skilled and trained Foreign Service officers who serve Democratic and Republican administrations alike, using their deep knowledge of foreign policy and their diplomatic skills to promote a more peaceful and secure world. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Ambassador Jonathan Cohen.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Peter. Thanks to Chris and Kathy for having me here today. Thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules to come here and explore the important work of the United Nations. Very tough to follow two extremely gifted politicians at the podium. I'm not a politician, I'm a diplomat, so bear with me as I go through my remarks. I'll tell you a little bit about my own background and then focus on the work that we're doing at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. First, I want to thank Congressman Engel for the strong words on anti-Israel bias, with which I wholeheartedly agree, and it's something that the administration is also working very hard on here at the UN. I also want to thank the Secretary General for his very inspiring remarks. He is a tremendous leader for this institution. As the acting permanent representative of the United States at the UN, it's very encouraging to see so many Americans from so many walks of life engaging in the work of this, the world's premier multilateral institution. This is where, more than anywhere else, the United States is partnering with other countries every day on virtually every issue on the global agenda. And it's been my great honor to represent the U.S. as a Foreign Service officer over the past 32 years. That means that I came in when Ronald Reagan was president. He signed my first commission, and I've worked for every administration since. And it's been a great honor to represent the people of the United States in postings from Bangkok to Baghdad, and now as our acting permanent representative here at the United Nations. And I'm extremely humbled to lead our missions team of around 115 talented and devoted public servants who strive every day to deliver for the American people here at the UN. To tell you a little bit about myself, I was born in Palo Alto and grew up in Laguna Beach, California, where my journey to this stage began as a 14-year-old participant in Laguna Beach High School Model United Nations. Anyone here from California? Welcome to New York. And anyone here involved in Model United Nations? For those of you who aren't, consider getting involved. It was my greatest dream someday as a student in Model UN to end up in a place like this. I never imagined it would be at this podium in front of an audience like you all, but what a great journey it's been. And I really encourage you all who are pursuing this to keep at it. As Congressman Engel said, spend time with the committees in Washington who work on foreign relations, spend time here in New York, stay involved. It's great that you are. It's really great to see you all here and see the support for America's work in this institution. My journey to American diplomacy isn't just because of Model United Nations. I was also a foreign exchange student in France, and in university studied international politics, as I'm sure many of you do, and Near Eastern studies. I joined the diplomatic corps at the age of 22, right out of graduate school, and spent most of my career representing the U.S. overseas at postings in Europe and the Middle East. Here at the UN, I've been working since June last year, principally as the deputy to Nikki Haley, and then when she left on January 1st, I became the acting permanent representative. And every day I've been working on a wide range of U.S. foreign policy objectives, as Peter described in the beginning, set forth by the President, including trying to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of the UN, all while promoting international peace and security and defending human rights and human dignity around the world. In our mission to the UN, we strive to ensure that the U.S. remains a leader on the issues that matter most to the American citizens, and that we harness the UN's potential as a force multiplier on issues from peacekeeping to humanitarian assistance to human rights. Let me spend a few minutes talking about our work in the Security Council. As you all know, there are 15 members of the Council, 5 permanent members, 10 non-permanent members who are elected to 2-year terms, and the presidency of the Council rotates every month. It just so happened that in 2018, my first year here at the UN, the U.S. held the presidency during September, which coincides with the annual General Assembly High-Level Week, when all eyes are on the UN as we welcome the leaders from every corner of the world to discuss the most pressing challenges on the international agenda. Having the presidency of the Council provides an opportunity to help frame the global security agenda for that month. So during our month as president, we held the Council's first ever meeting on the situation in Nicaragua in response to a wave of government repression, intimidation, and indiscriminate violence, which left hundreds dead and thousands wounded. It's not easy to add a new subject to the Security Council's agenda. There are council members who are fundamentally opposed to discussing, for example, human rights issues there. We disagree with that, and in the case of Nicaragua, we knew how important it was for the Security Council to be briefed on the situation on the ground, to understand how protests, initially against pension reform, met government repression, which grew to threaten regional security, and to learn how the Organization of American States was working to find solutions to the serious crisis in our hemisphere. We also held the first ever Security Council briefing focused on how corruption affects global conflicts, both as a driver of conflict and as an obstacle to conflict resolution. Although we often treat corruption as an afterthought when it comes to peace and security, we believe it also is, in cases, a fundamental cause of conflict, and we think the Security Council should address that. As a case study for the nexus between corruption and peace and security, we followed up with a public event on Venezuela. Mind you, this was back in September, 5 months ago. That event highlighted how pervasive corruption in Venezuela had led to the worst man-made humanitarian crisis in the history of this hemisphere, and one of the worst global humanitarian crises in a generation, with millions of Venezuelans forced to flee to neighboring countries. We highlighted the responsibility of Maduro and his cronies for the deepening crisis, and the need for the international community to do more. The situation in Venezuela, of course, has come to the forefront in recent weeks. And as you may know, last month we convened the Security Council for a debate on Venezuela with Secretary of State Pompeo in the chair for the United States. And we're continuing to look for ways we can work with and within the UN system to help the plight of the Venezuelan people. My team here remains seized with and working hard on Venezuela every day. In the Security Council, we have regularly raised the topic of human rights violations, even when it's uncomfortable for some of the other members for us to do so, whether in Iran, Burma, North Korea, Syria, or elsewhere. Some Security Council members want to avoid engaging on these topics for a variety of reasons, but we're determined and unflinching in our commitment to shed light on the worst abuses in the world, including in the UN Security Council. In my 8 months at the UN, the Security Council has dealt with situations in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Horn of Africa, Mali, South Sudan, Burundi, Libya, Syria, Iran, Iraq, the West Bank and Gaza, Western Sahara, Lebanon, Yemen, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Cyprus, Ukraine, and on and on and on. In each case, we spoke out strongly for U.S. interests and strove to ensure that they were reflected in Security Council decisions and statements. In our work at the UN, we're also focused intensely on humanitarian crises and humanitarian response. For far too long, the conflict in Syria has caused one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions displaced and hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. We consistently call for accountability for the atrocities committed by the Assad regime, including its use of chemical weapons against its own people. We're also engaged here in a determined effort to make UN peacekeeping missions more effective, efficient, and accountable, with a specific focus on improving peacekeeper performance, including eliminating sexual exploitation and abuse. And on September 21st, when we were president of the Security Council, we oversaw the adoption of a groundbreaking UN resolution establishing a transparent reporting process for performance failures, real accountability measures for those failures, and objective criteria to match the right police and troops with the right peacekeeping roles. UN peacekeepers are doing great and important work around the world, and we're trying to ensure they have the best possible guidance and support. There are about 100,000 UN peacekeepers from dozens of countries in 15 missions around the world, and it's a great privilege to be here to support them as well. In our work at the UN, we're also focusing intensely, as I mentioned, on the humanitarian crisis and response. In all of this, from humanitarian work to peacekeeping to Security Council work to human rights, there are several unifying themes: protecting lives, advancing human dignity, maintaining international peace and security. These are the founding principles of the UN. They're also U.S. values, and they require U.S. leadership and U.S. engagement with the UN to advance them. Because we have an obligation to ensure that the generous contributions of U.S. taxpayers to the UN budget are spent responsibly, as the Secretary General mentioned, the U.S. is the largest financial contributor to the UN, contributing 22% to the regular budget and 25% to the peacekeeping budget. We are committed to pressing the UN to reduce waste and to avoid mission creep wherever we can. Throughout my career, I've seen many ways the UN can contribute to international peace and security. I've worked with UN representatives, agencies, and on UN issues in just about every Foreign Service posting I've had, from my first assignment in Thailand as a refugee protection officer, visiting refugee camps along the Lao and Cambodian borders, to coordinating aid programs in the West Bank, to working with the UN peace forces in Cyprus, to my most recent overseas tour in Iraq, where I worked with the UN humanitarian coordinator, Lise Grande, who, as Congressman Engel mentioned, is now in Yemen, to develop a stabilization program that got over 2 million internally displaced Iraqis home safely at very low cost. In the field, I've seen the UN rise to challenges and exceed expectations, delivering peace, security, and relief with strong U.S. leadership and strong U.S. involvement. So I know what this institution can do when it's at its best and when we support it. The UN could be an even more effective, efficient tool in the service of our and its goals. That's why we're strongly supporting the UN Secretary General's reform agenda. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So we are committed to working harder to making the UN a more effective, more efficient, more results-oriented body. Our constructive engagement with the United Nations can strengthen UN security and prosperity, while also strengthening that of all other nations. During his address to the UN General Assembly at this stage in September, President Trump noted that the United Nations has unlimited potential and made clear the U.S. is committed to making the UN more effective and accountable. Ultimately, a UN that's more efficient, accountable, results-oriented, and transparent is one that will better live up to the promise and the vision of its charter, and one that will do more to secure not only U.S. interests, but those of its other member states. From peacekeeping to caring for refugees and others in desperate humanitarian need, to serving as a platform to shine a bright light on human rights abuses and threats to international peace and security, including trying to end wars and keep the peace. It's hard and important work for U.S. interests and for those of the rest of the world. But the UN is playing a vital role, and we're committed to making it an even better institution as it fulfills that role. With that, let me once again thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here today and support the important work of the United Nations. It is indeed a great honor to represent all of you here at the UN, and I thank you for your attention.
Ambassador Cohen, thank you for your remarks and for spending time with us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Don Lewis, President for Professional Hygiene for Essity, a global health and hygiene company with a passionate commitment to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. UNA USA and the UN Foundation have partnered with Essity for the past 3 years to catalyze dialogue, new thinking, and creative partnerships for addressing global challenges such as saving lives and advancing human dignity by improving access to hygiene and also connecting the SDGs to new constituencies worldwide, be they in corporate boardrooms or on college campuses. Don, we're delighted you're here to join us today.
Good morning. On behalf of the nearly 50,000 employees at Essity around the globe, it's really a great honor to be a part of this summit. A matter of fact, it's one of my most favorite days of the year. I was actually supposed to be in Stockholm at a board meeting, and I excused myself because it was so important for me to be here with all of you. To be in this great room, the United Nations Assembly Hall, where so much history has taken place, and to be joined by His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Congressman Engel, and Ambassador Cohen, and my many friends at the United Nations Foundation. It's truly a great privilege. You know, we may not make history here today, but I feel certain that the conversations that we'll have today can change history towards making the world a safer and more sustainable place to live. Today we talk about the power of shared partnerships and shared responsibilities. At Essity, we are proud to partner with the United Nations Foundation to continue to drive global dialogue around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm sure you know about the United Nations, I'm sure you know about the SDGs. I bet most of you have never heard about Essity before. Essity is one of the world's largest health and hygiene companies. We do business in over 150 countries. We make essential necessities, hence the name essity, that are used by 1 billion people every day. Things like paper towels and napkins, incontinence and feminine care products, and products used in wound care by doctors and nurses. To bring it down to something that's more familiar, if you've ever been to a Dunkin' Donuts and you've used a napkin, it's our napkin. So give you an idea of the places we're in. Many of the health and hygiene issues our products address deal with topics that are either taken for granted, like hand washing, or go unspoken, like incontinence. We're bringing attention to these issues with our work with the SDGs. By partnering with the United Nations Foundation and other organizations, we're drawing attention to the fact that improving access to health and hygiene can change lives. In some cases, we're doing that one conversation at a time. In fact, sometimes one conversation can truly make a difference. At last year's Global Summit, I had a conversation with many people here, students just like yourselves. And a photo, please. I'll relate one story. There were two people that I spoke to in particular that kept in correspondence with me, Patrick and Jonas. They corresponded with me afterwards on LinkedIn after we had some initial conversation. And they made apparent to me some of the work that they were doing with an organization through their chapter in Kentucky called La Casita. La Casita helps families that have immigrated to the Louisville area and helps them transition into the community. They told me that one of the things that these families really needed were basic products that we take for granted, like paper towels and toilet tissue. We make a lot of both of these, and we do it with 100% recycled fiber. When I heard about this, I said I'd be glad to help. We're the global market leader, and we have a lot of this available. So we got together with our Torque brand and our local manufacturing facility, and we donated a lot of this product to help them. And it was really not our efforts, it was their efforts and persistency and passion reaching out to me and allowing us to help. And by this, they were able to improve the lives of a lot of these people. I wasn't expecting to have that conversation that day, but I'm really glad it took place because it made a long-term connection and allowed me to help. I'm convinced that if we truly listen to each other, that we can really make a difference and we can make the world a better place. Today we listen to each other and other experts on ways to solve many of the world's most pressing challenges. From humanitarian conflict to female empowerment to nuclear proliferation and human rights. And those are just the topics we're going to talk about before lunch. So while these are big issues, I have a lot of confidence in all of you and what we can achieve and what you can achieve. My colleagues and I left last year's summit with an overwhelming sense of optimism about students like you and what you're doing, and the topics that you're focused on at this summit. As a person that's been out of school for a long time, I really want to applaud you being here today for putting your energy towards these big, important issues. And I invite you to look for partners with government, NGOs, and companies like Essity, because together we really can make a difference. I'm proud of all of you for taking the initiative to be here and the work you do every day. It's going to be a truly meaningful day, and we look forward to listening and joining in the conversations with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And now we're about to move into our breakout sessions. We have a lot of great sessions for you today, but before you move, I just want to explain, if you're interested in an issues track anytime today, that will always be in the General Assembly Hall. If you're interested in an action track, that will always be in conference room number 4. If you need an ASL interpreter, please come see me. And if at any time of the day you have a trouble hearing, you have those earphones in front of you that you can put on. They do work. So, and one last thing, if you have any questions, we have staff and volunteers wearing an Ask Me button, so please reach out to them if you have any questions. So before you move, just want to tell you where the next 2 sessions are. If you're interested in the conflict resolution and humanitarian response on Yemen, you'll stay here. And if you're interested in the hashtag Leave No Girl Behind, changing the world to empower girls, you'll go to conference room 4. So if you're going to conference room 4, you can exit out on the sides and you'll go down one level and into conference room 4. So I hope you have an enjoyable day and I look forward to seeing you later on.